This is Raoul Eshelman, and I'm very honored to have him on this podcast. He is a Slavist, so a literary critic concerning with Slavist literature, and for years he has taught at the Ludwig Maximilian University at Munich, and now he's retired, but he recently wrote and published a new book. It is titled Transcending Postmodernism, Performatism 2.0. I understand that this is a sequel to his book in 2008 titled Performatism or the End of Postmodernism. Of course, the former book will be addressed at some length, but we'll be focusing on the new book now. Raoul, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And I'm just fine. I'm very happy to be here myself, and I'm glad to talk about performatism, postmodernism, and other things.
Of course, yeah. I've been hoping to address postmodernism at some point on this podcast, and you're one of the fine choices to address it. So, tell me, how does the Transcending Postmodernism book update or develop the idea that was first proposed in performatism or the end of postmodernism?
Yeah, well, first of all, what I didn't do in the first book was to really address competing theories of postmodernism because there were almost none. This was in 2008. And as of about 2010, the sort of competing theories in literary theory and literary criticism began to spring up, so that by 15 years later, I can say that there are maybe 8, 9, 10 theories that out there that are interesting and that are in need of some sort of commentary, positive, negative, whatever. So this was one major goal of what I was doing. Another one was to develop certain points that were not addressed as specifically in the first book. I think one was time. This was, in other words, I took a somewhat more philosophical approach than in the first book, which dealt with various things with architecture, with art, with different genres. In this case, I stayed fixated on narrative genres of novels, basically of literary fiction and film, and I focus on, I think, 5 different things. I think that's time, subjectivity, ethics. You have to fill in the blanks. Ethics, globalism, and I have to look. I even have to look at my own contents to see what I did. What I'm missing. Yes, aesthetic, sexuality, and transcendence. So these are all topics that were not addressed directly in the first book, and now the focus in the second book is on those.
Okay. Well, I suppose we should also begin by you giving us a working definition of postmodernism. So what is it and why is it important?
Postmodernism as opposed to postmodernism. Okay, postmodernism.
Postmodernism, yes.
Okay, postmodernism. Postmodernism, from my point of view, is a reaction to the excesses of the catastrophe of modernism, meaning in this case the Holocaust, Gulag, the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that you can say that the modernism, with its utopian strivings, with its striving for innovation, leads to the catastrophe of the Second World War, basically, and of these totalitarian systems. And postmodernism, from my point of view, in historical terms, develops as a kind of an answer, as a defensive answer to these catastrophes. And the answer is not a direct one. In other words, you don't want to repeat modernism again. You don't want to go over and do modernism better than the modernists did, because they did a really bad job of it. Just to repeat it would be to repeat the disaster. So the mechanisms, the strategies that these authors, writers, thinkers develop are defensive in nature and are kind of ad hoc. They develop over a fairly long period of time. And this basically gets going in the 1960s with the cultural revolution in America, with excuse me, with the beginning of post-structuralism in France, and in also, of course, then in America. So in historical terms, this is the basic time that we're talking about. The strategies that postmodernism develops have to do, first of all, with one of the main strategy, I think, if you want to reduce it to something that is very, very basic, is to produce difference as much as possible. In other words, the answer to this modernist striving for some sort of utopian goal, whatever it is to produce difference as much as possible. You find that in individual formulations, philosophical formulations such as différance. But if you look at all the major post-structuralist philosophers, you will find that they all privilege difference, basically. And you find essentially the same thing in literature or in the arts and other disciplines. For example, in fiction, you have metafiction, you have the multiplication of different levels that interfere with one another, creating constant, irreducible differences in narrative strategies. Just to give one example of how this works. So this is the basic starting point of my thought, that for me, postmodernism is an ethical enterprise. It's not a frivolous play with science. It's not escapism. It is a deeply ethical attempt to avoid the catastrophe or catastrophes of modernism.
Okay. Well, to put it in more concrete terms, what would you give as an example of an artwork, a film, or a book that is consciously postmodernist?
Well, one of my favorite books is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, a very well-known book, and basically he starts out to write a war novel. This is the premise. How do you write a war novel after the Second World War? And basically he's not able to do it, because if he did it, he says this, Kurt Vonnegut, who is basically appears as the author in his own work, says that it's simply not possible to write this kind of heroic narrative that maybe somebody like Ernest Hemingway would have written in For Whom the Bell Tolls. And what he does instead is, of course, he introduces a science fiction plot into his own story, which is in a certain sense a fairly, I would say it's a non-heroic story about how he survived the bombing of Dresden. What is also ethically important is a victimary discourse, that now and this is now reversed, that in this book, the Germans are the victims rather than the perpetrators, and we are asked to identify with these victims along with the main protagonist. And to top things off, to make things completely postmodern, the whole book is characterized by what we in the trade call metalepsis, which means that one narrative level gets confused with another, so that the hero, Billy Pilgrim, is moving through time. He moves back and forth through time because the Tralfamadorians, the aliens, are able to do so, and they play with him. He moves back and forth in time, and this is exactly how the narrative operates. So the narrative operates according to a fictional principle that the narrative has established in the beginning, which is that you can move anywhere in time in a fairly arbitrary way. So if taken together, this makes the movie, not the movie, well, there's a movie too, which is also essentially the same, and makes the novel quintessentially postmodern.
Yeah, I've been wanting to read that one for years now, and I really should.
Yeah, I really love it. I mean, it was, and this goes back to my own experience. I mean, I read it in the 1970s when I was, I think, a teenager and or a young person. And this, like I said, this was a very important work, not only aesthetically, but also ethically.
Yes. I got a peek at the bookshelf that you got, and I believe I saw a copy of Infinite Jest there by David Foster Wallace.
Yes.
I unlike Solid House 5, I actually read that book, and I find it to be, an incredible literary work, literary achievement. It also, I think, came out at the right time too. It was published in 1996, and I think, at least in the United States, people were looking for a book like that, and Wallace was able to satisfy that itch. So, would you say that it also is a work of postmodernist literature?
It's a transitional work from my point of view. That basically the way the book is written, it's very it produces an enormous amount of, let us say, difference. That there are all kinds of characters, that the plot is very confusing, that the I would also say that in ethical terms, the main hero doesn't really have very much agency. I think at the end he's winds up on a beach half dead. He's not somebody who is really in control of his own fate. But what Wallace does is that within this very postmodern structure of the novel, basically, it's simply a very convoluted, very complicated novel. He places several characters that are no longer postmodern. And one is the name of the characters. The main character that I think one of the characters is lame. He's compared to a spider. I forget what his name is. Maybe you can help me with the name. I would have to.
I've read it a long time ago, so yeah, my memory is just as foggy as yours. But I can
Yes.
remember that the years are now named after like big companies and corporations. So and
Yeah.
also their products. I think it's something like the year of the Big Mac or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So there are a lot of these references, these references to popular culture, which is very typical of this sort of, postmodern play with consumer culture. But this one character is modeled on a Dostoevsky character from the brothers Karamazov, basically. This is Alyosha, who is a kind of a very meek, saintly figure. And this character, you can maybe take a look at him and see who it is. I can also, I suppose, look in my notes and see what the name is. But this character has these saintly qualities, and he is also somebody who is immune to the discourse around him. This is another thing that I think is very typical of postmodern literature, is that characters lack autonomy, they lack agency because the discourse around them basically controls them, or basically it keeps them from achieving whatever goals they have. And this one character, this sort of Alyosha character, is unaffected by this discourse. And this was, for me, this was a sign that Wallace was attempting to get out of postmodernism, and of which, of course, he was trying to do in a philosophical or critical way. but I think he never quite achieved it in his own novels.
I see. Yeah. I'm also reading Brothers Karamazov here too. So
Okay, so if you
it's been
if
a
you have
minute.
that right in hand, this is the parallel character. Yeah, I would have to take a quick look. Maybe you can edit it out while I take a quick look at the name of the character. Is that possible? That
Um,
or
Certainly.
is not necessary?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's fine.
what?
I mean, the character's name in Infinite Jest are pretty foggy to me also.
Okay, but wait a minute. I'll just take a quick look and see what because I. What is the best way of doing this? This is it's Mario Incandenza, I guess is the name of the character, which I had completely forgotten. And this is an entirely enclosed character who has a kind of aura, charismatic aura to him that rubs off on everyone around him. And this is kind of a prototype of what I would then come to call the performatist fool. That somebody who is a simpleton, somebody who has very simple ideals, simple characteristics, but these characteristics are not are impervious to the surrounding discourse, the infinite jest, if you will, that is circulating around him.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Now I remember the character's name. So thank you for reminding me, and of course all of us who are reading or have read the book. Now, since you mentioned Infinite Jest being a transitional novel, and this, I believe, this is where your idea of performatism can come in. Would you say that it is transitioning towards a performative direction?
Yes, because of these individual characters, I think this is a sign, so to speak, that Wallace is trying to get out of this nightmare of discourse that postmodernism has engendered. He doesn't quite do it, but it's a step in, you could say, in the right direction.
Okay. Well, so what are some of the limits of postmodernism that performatism can answer or transcend?
There are several, well, there are numerous points. The first is I think the lack of agency that postmodernism says we're exposed to, or that is yeah, well, we just don't have it basically. In other words, whatever we say is governed by a discourse in some way. Our desires, are, even if they seem very goal-oriented, are being constantly led astray by the signs around us, the signs of consumer society, or in the Soviet case, the signs of socialist society. And our language, of course, is also something that is not reliable. That our language is always being split up, so that the meanings we assign to signs are always come too late, and are in a certain sense disperse, are disseminated into other signifieds, and so on and so forth. So that these are the problems created by this privileging of difference in postmodernism. And of course, the result of this is a kind of, as has been noted very, very often, is a kind of general state of irony. In other words, whatever you want to do will, in a certain sense, turn out or can turn out to be the opposite of your own intention. So this is a state that you find yourself in around, I would say, the mid 1990s. It was something that Wallace felt very strongly. It was felt by many people, many creative people, to a much lesser extent by academics. But the reaction that I call performatism tries to return this this agency to characters, just to stay in the narrative mode. I think that's the easiest way to do it, by creating separated characters that are separated from discourse. So this is the sort of the formal basis of how performatist narratives arise. You have characters like Maria Incandenza who are not affected by discourse. And these characters, as I discovered, tend to have the characteristics of being simpletons, of being fools, simply because what they do seems to be illogical and unproductive from the point of view of discourse. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have geniuses. So you have basically two types of subject that are both have a tradition of being divinely inspired. Okay, now, obviously, we live in a secular age, and nobody is literally suggesting that Maria Incandenza or similar characters are divinely guided. But the point is that in terms of fictional constructs, these are characters that transmit a feeling of transcendence because we don't have discursive access to their own logic. Their logic, in other words, whatever is guiding them is something that we can't understand. And these novels or films, as the case may be, block our access to that understanding. This is the one major building block of what I would call a performatist narrative.
I see. Yeah. I'm reminded somewhat of the novel Life of Pi, which I believe was released in 2001. It was made into a movie in 2012. Incidentally, the author of Life of Pi also went to the same university that I attended, Trent, in Peterborough, Ontario.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Not at the same time, of course, but we graduated from the same university. The character's name is, of course, an anomaly, but I get the impression that he seems to be the only one that's like religious in the novel, and to what extent, to a certain extent, he's going on a somewhat unsuccessful quest to make other people religious like him, because when he tries to tell the story with the tiger, the Japanese people who are recording his testimony was like, well, that's just not believable. So he substituted it with the story involving cannibalism and such.
Yeah, well, the basic idea, I think, of the novel is, okay, that Pi, for those who are not familiar with the book or the film, is a boy who believes in, I think, in Hinduism, Christianity. He's also a Muslim at the same time, and he is also, the ship that he sails on has a Kabbalistic name, so that all major world religions are involved in his story. He also says he just wants to believe in God. He just wants to believe in in something unified, and he's not interested in sort of the institutional differences. So once more, this idea of unity is much more important than difference. But what makes Pi interesting or characteristic, let's say, from my point of view, is that he's obviously not going to convince anybody in theological terms, but the book convinces you aesthetically. What happens is that his story, which is rather unbelievable, it runs over 250 pages. It's rather long. It's a beautiful story. It's an uplifting story. And it is contrasted with the true story, or the more plausible story, which is short and ugly. And at the end, I think the Japanese insurance adjusters who come to interview him, and after hearing the story, they say, well, no, it's not, your long story isn't very plausible. But in the end, they put it into their claims report. So that the book is basically demonstrating in this way that even if you're very rational, even if you're a claims adjuster, even if you're doing things by the numbers, that an aesthetic gesture will convince you. And I think this is the point of the book, and this is also another main point of performatism, is this is the return of the aesthetic. In other words, that the construction of beauty, of transcendence, of love, of reconciliation, of positive qualities is something that is transformative, something that is also in a certain sense, a sign of the transcendent.
So how does performative theory treat belief as opposed to postmodernists?
Well, it's also diametrically opposed in the sense that postmodernism is very Nietzschean. It is essentially a critique of all belief systems. I think this is the best way to put it, that both in terms of philosophy, certainly, but also in terms of narrative. Postmodernism is trying to break down any sort of belief, and to critique belief, to break it up, to disseminate it, to disperse it, to demonstrate. I think the whole point of deconstruction is simply to take the logic of believing in something and demonstrate that it's not possible to do this, that this belief will produce contradictory or opposite results to your own intention. So this is the basic model of postmodernism, and performatism basically causes us to believe using what are essentially aesthetic constructs.
Okay. Can you pinpoint a moment, either in your experience or in time, when you see that postmodernism may have run its course?
I think, well, personally, for me, this was the movie, I think, Burn After Reading or Burn Before Reading. This is
Right, I know that one. The Cohen.
this is a Cohen brothers movie about I forget what the title was either ironic or not ironic. Burn Before Reading, Burn After
Burn
Reading.
After Reading.
Burn After Reading. Okay.
I think it refers to either, the act of reading a book, but it also refers to like reading CDs, where you copy the files of the CD into the computer, something like that.
Yeah, and it also, of course, refers to CIA practices where something is so secret that you have to burn it. And this movie, I thought, was just was very, very predictable from my point of view. The world is paranoid. The CIA is everywhere, but this CIA is dysfunctional. So you have a dysfunctional world. You have a world of paranoid dysfunctionality. And in other words, the paranoia is comic, becomes something comic. And there was a lot of slapstick in it. It was a movie that was moderately amusing. But this is the point for me when I felt that postmodernism was running out of things to do. This was at least my personal experience. This is I think the filmic example is the best one that I can come up with. I'm not quite sure of the date. I think it was 2004. It might have been a little later.
I see. From my memory, I think it was 2008. So right after the
2008
adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's No Country, and I was impressed by how they characterized the George Clooney and Brad Pitt characters. Here are like the two biggest movie stars, and they make them into like basically stooges.
Yeah. This was the thing that, in other words, postmodernism was the postmodernist Coen brothers were making these two big stars, were deconstructing these two big stars on screen and making them into, really, as you say, they were almost like the Three Stooges in those old comedies.
So would you say that performatism tries to answer some of the same questions that postmodernism tries to answer? Uh, Perhaps it may be providing a better one, better answer.
I'm not sure about the if they're really pursuing the same things at all. I think they're pretty much diametrically opposed in most cases. In other words, a performantist would not be interested in the endless critique of existing orders. A performatist would be interested in establishing some sort of separated state from which we can operate in some way, which we can achieve some sort of inkling of transcendence, even if it's not realized completely. It's a completely different mindset. It's a complete. I would say it's for the most part it's a completely different set of questions that interest performatists.
Mhm. And what might those questions be?
Well, those questions are how do we bond? How do we stop being ironic? How do we believe? I mean, these are things that a postmodernist would sniff at, sneeze at, would immediately start to critique, deconstruct, whatever. So that these very basic questions about belief, about experiencing transcendence, about experiencing unity with an other of some kind, somebody else, are all very basic things that drive performatism and are sort of simply anathema, to use a specifically religious term, to postmodernism.
Would you say that it emphasizes commonality rather than difference, as opposed to, of course, the postmodernist thinking?
I'm not sure about commonality, if that is the proper word. Commonality to me implies something like social on a social level, on a larger social level. I'm not sure if that is really operative in performatist narrative. What is operative is the idea. I think that what is more important is the idea of bonding at on the lowest possible level. In other words, that this idea of dyadic bonding, you could say, is absolutely central to all performatist strategies, novels, narratives, whatever you want to take. And they build on these. And the extent to which this bonding leads to then some sort of larger commonality is fairly open. But I think the problem of commonality is that you have to be very, very careful, because it leads down the path of some sort of totalitarianism ultimately. So that also the performatism obviously is learned from the experience of modernism, of the Second World War, of these utopian projects that have all failed in a catastrophic way. And so that performatist projects on a social or political scale tend to be fairly small, or fairly restricted in size, simply because of, or in scope, simply because of this focus on bonding.
Okay. Well, I understand that postmodernism as well as performatism is very much focused on literature and literary criticism. But of course, totalitarianism is, in many ways, a political term. So, what are some ways in which performatist theories, your performatist theory, address the concern for totalitarianism in um, literary works in general?
Well, first of all, I think totalitarianism is, as a problem, is basically no longer really existent. Perhaps in North Korea, this might be one of the few totalitarian systems that is still in existence. The problem that I think the performatism addresses, obviously the same problem that also that postmodernism addresses, is that of globalization and how to deal with globalization. And this is, like I said, is done not by proposing utopian counter projects that would encompass large groups of like-minded people, but by building up pockets of or spheres. I think this is what Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher, calls them. He calls them spheres. He calls when you have a lot of spheres or bubbles. I think bubbles is his basic unit of dyadic bonding. When you get a lot of bubbles, you get foams, and he tries to describe these foams in social terms. But these foams consist of a multiplicity of these smaller bonded units. I think this is this is one way of that a performatist would approach this problem of globalization.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Sloterdijk. I've been getting familiarized with his works. I may not be as familiar with his works as you are, but I get the impression that he has a synthesis of ecology and humanism, in that he believes that humans have a space in the environment and the preservation of the environment, unlike several other environmentalist schools that believe that humans have a negative impact on it. So that's what I've reached so far. So Jean-Paul Sartre, not a postmodernist, says that his philosophy, existentialism, is a humanism. Would you say the same regarding performatism?
No, it's not humanism. It's not. Let's see where to begin. I think humanism assumes that there is some sort of essence that we all share in some way, whatever it is. The 19th century humanism would stress rationality, it would stress possibly also the ability to believe, the ability to communicate. This is sort of 19th century hermeneutics. Sartre's kind of humanism also presupposes, I think, a kind of essence, a sort of a subject, a core subjectivity that is somehow the basis, a positive basis for the development of human relations, as far as I remember his philosophy. And performatism is not, it doesn't have this, as far as I've been able to tell. It's based more on this notion of formal separation. In other words, the idea is that you block out the environment, you block out the discourse, so you block out on both sides. Sloterdijk is also says that this bonding, this dyadic bonding, separates us from the environment and also protects us from the environment, as it inoculates us against this environment, which is basically trying to get us in a certain sense, so that the human does exist, but it does not have any particular essence, I would say. Another approach to this is taken by Eric Gantz, who is a proponent of what he calls what he calls anthropoetics, or generative anthropology, and his idea is that it is the only thing that is really peculiar to humans is language, and language is, once more, enables the apprehension of transcendence, and it enables obviously the production of culture. But it's not an essence in this traditional humanistic sense. And it is also arises through the desire to to avert violence, to defer violence, and to use his terms, so that it's not a positive essence that we all carry in our souls or in our hearts or in our minds. At the very beginning a mechanism, a defensive mechanism that allows us to separate from nature, allows us to separate from the animal world, and to produce, of course, then culture, belief, the ability to believe, the ability to create relations of trust between otherwise warring or warring humans.
So, what are some ways that globalization can affect the production and consumption of art and literature?
That's a very big question that uh, it's almost too big to answer. It's also not something that I really have dealt with a lot. I wouldn't know where to begin answering that. Obviously, it's everywhere, simply because of social media, because of digitalization. It affects us all, but in very many different ways. And I would have to start with some sort of specific topic in order to answer that.
Okay. I kind of want to defer to one specific postmodernist thinker, Michel Foucault, who, I believe in the order of things was discipline and punish. He believes that um, in many ways we are coerced not by a central authority, but by very much a decentralized um, notions of keeping things in order, keeping people in line. Uh, in his philosophy, we can be both a person being coerced and also being the person who's doing the coercing. And I wonder if you see the globalization process affecting humans the same way, in that there's no central global authority, but we feel compelled to adhere to a certain standard of being, so as to, I suppose, to fit in with the global standard that is ever changing, so to speak.
I think that my performatist answer would be that obviously that there is a tendency towards this. Obviously, that globalization tends to force certain things on you, whether you like it or not. But at the same time, you have the option in digital media to create your own bubbles or spheres. I think this is there's a kind of dialectic involved between this, mediatic force that is basically that we're all swimming in, or this mediatic soup that we're all swimming in, that is very hard to disengage from, and at the same time, you do have the opportunity to create your own bubble, your own sphere. This is something, of course, that also has led to a great deal of polarization, political polarization, that you tend to remain within your own bubble, your own ideological bubble. But this is something that is eminently possible. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Well, yeah. So another aspect of globalization is capitalism, which again, it's an economic term, but it is being treated a lot in literary criticism, both postmodernist and performatist. So I would pose the same question. What are some of the effects of global capitalism on art and literature?
I would give a similar answer that, well, I could contrast the postmodern approach and the performativist approach. I think postmodernism was always looking to the periphery for defensive mechanisms, that they placed those, the third world, they placed their hope in the subaltern groups of people, in people who were oppressed in some way, in people in others, in general. And so otherness, heterogeneity, being peripheral, all these things had an ethical value in postmodernism, also both in literature and in critical thinking. And what I think happened is that these peripheries have lost defensive this defensive power, basically. I think that capitalism, instead of the peripheries resisting more or less successfully, they've all been pretty much gobbled up by capitalism. There was, I think, and I remember doing a little piece on a girl in the Amazon rainforest who got hold of, well, didn't get hold of the internet. It was a normal part of their lives. She began a kind of on TikTok or or Instagram, one of these social media things, began giving little I don't know what you would call clips of her life in the rainforest. And she after several months, she had like 2 million followers, something like that. So that there is no more periphery that would be able to really, that is so other that it would be able to resist global capitalism. I think it's basically everywhere, with once more the possible exception of North Korea. There are very, very few exceptions. There are very, very few countries or even, ethnic groups that have been able to resist this sort of assimilation into capitalism. So that in performatism, the focus shifts once more to these enclaves of within capitalism, where you try to, if you decide to resist or cope with capitalism, you do it consciously within capitalism, and you try to create these spheres, bubbles, whatever, where you can develop strategies that somehow counter capitalism.
Yeah. So, is it the case that if we are to resist, capitalism's this, ever-growing invisible hand, so to speak, is that all we can do, like create bubbles or spheres within capitalist systems that function in different rules and norms than the conventional capitalist structure?
Yeah, this I think was the original tendency. The newer tendency is, of course, is populism. This is something that can also be described to a certain extent, at least in performance terms, that the populism, it tends to be right-wing populism, but there's also obviously left-wing populism. And this kind of populism functions through charismatic leaders. In other words, the religious dimension or this quasi-religious dimension that is central to performative culture is realized in charismatic figures like Trump, like Viktor Orban, like who have you not, that have been popping up in world politics in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. This is not necessarily, obviously, a positive development, but it is a definite. Let us say it is different than. It's also it's incidentally also a kind of resistance to global capital, to global capitalism. But it's obviously there are a lot of problems involved with it.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I'm living in Hungary, and I attended a speech given by the Prime Minister Orban on the anniversary of the 1848 revolution. And yeah, I can certainly say that, despite my very slight grasp of Hungarian, I can say that he's very charismatic, and people reacted to him very positively. And I can certainly see that some of the most popular politicians that we have today are accomplished performers, um, in the sense that they know what they know what their audience is, they know what the audience wants, and they know how to deliver that to them. Um, of course, you know, however dubious their political programs may be, but at the same time, I see that the the people that we entrust as performers, so actors and theater people and um, workers of the arts, they have become increasingly political, as in the case with what the Oscar ceremony or any gathering of big name performers. So, why do you believe this is so? Politicians become more like performers, and performers being more like politicians.
Well, with as far as the actors go, I think this was for a long time very much the case, at least in my recollection, that if you think back to Marlon Brando rejecting the Oscars, that there is, or a Native American it takes the Oscar in his place. This has a long tradition in Hollywood. Tradition goes back quite a ways. This is not something that is in itself is really new. But what is new is that, as you say, is that politicians become performers. That the idea of projecting agency, once more agency being a very positive quality in this performance culture, that if you can project agency, if you also have a kind of charismatic personality, these things work very powerfully in political terms. This is something that is, and obviously charismatic politicians are nothing new. But these politicians, I think everyone would agree this is a fairly recent development and is not based on the sort of, I think, postmodern idea of politics as politicians being basically lying about everything, or basically being saying what the people want to hear. I think this would be the postmodern the idea of what a politician is. These are politicians who have distinct goals, which you may not agree with or may not like, but they do project this agency, and this agency also is important for it is supported by their charismatic personalities and vice versa.
Um, what example of either a film or a literary work can you name that, in some ways, exemplify this fight for or against human agency that you can think of?
For human agency, um, there are lots and lots. Basically, almost any performative narrative will contain these elements. In other words, that you will usually not find the performatist, the protagonist will almost always, they may not prevail in the end, but they will be able to play out their agency, or their in some way. I think that, I don't know, a random I'm starting to speak German, excuse me. Random example is, I think, what is it? The imagination game, is that the with the Alan Turing story?
Imitation thing, right?
Imitation game, excuse me, the imitation game, where Turing is somebody who is, he's an oddball. He's depicted as being almost autistic. He is also somebody who is homosexual, obviously, who is separated from these, in a sense, also persecuted ultimately, and dies because of it. But what the movie shows is that he, in spite of being a weak figure in both physically and also socially, he is basically able to, in a certain sense, to basically he wins the Second World War in a certain sense. And this is part of one of the premises of the film. And of course, he also prefigures our positive approach to things like homosexuality, to the computer age, this sort of thing. So that instead of focusing on his victimization, the film, which was real, very real, it basically killed him. But the film focuses on his agency, the fact that he could actually, even in spite of being socially weak, he was able to prevail.
I see. Yeah, I can name something that's in the opposite, runs in somewhat in the opposite direction, and that I believe is Dave Eggers' The Circle. Of course, Eggers was also an important figure in the postmodernist tradition with his memoir. Right? Yeah, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's really well known. But yeah, the circle is in some ways a critique of the social media age. So very much a symbol of globalization and capitalism. You see the main characters, I believe May is her name, and her former boyfriend, uh, in order to secure his agency, in cutting himself off of the circles, his technological grasp, he's willing to basically just kill himself and end his own life. While the main character May, she becomes more and more absorbed in the world of the circle, and eventually, basically losing whatever individuality she has, because the circle demands a lot from her.
Yeah, no, I haven't read that, so I can't really comment on it. But if you look at almost any film made in the 1970s, 1980s, novels written in that time, you will basically find characters who are who want to, basically they start out with some sort of agency. Obviously they start out wanting to realize some sort of goal, and are completely unable to do so. Random example would be a film like Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, the private detective who is in the end, who is absolutely, he finds the villain, but the villain drives away with the little girl that he's going to molest, and
Yeah.
the Jack Nicholson character can't do anything about it. And he says, "This is Chinatown," and this is, of course, in a certain sense, the postmodern attitude is that we have to endure evil. We can recognize evil, we can uncover evil, but ultimately we are probably not able to really stop it, and we have to endure it. And this is also an important part of postmodern ethics that performatism basically tries to get away from.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, well, you might like The Circle. It has it has similar themes. I wouldn't recommend the movie, but the book is really good.
Okay, I'll take a look at it.
And yeah, so the Eggers' memoir is titled "A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius." You may or may not have heard of it, but
Yes, no, I have read it, actually. I have read it. I would also think it's performatist in several ways. It was a long time ago, so I can't really analyze it spontaneously, but it seemed to me once more that it was not a novel of victimization, but a novel of bonding. I think this is the one thing: he bonds with his younger brother after his parents die, and this is the main focus of the novel ultimately.
Okay. So finally, Jean-Francois Lyotard, French postmodernist thinker, proclaimed that we live in a postmodernist condition. Would you say the same today in regards to performatism? Are we living in a performatist condition?
That's a bit more difficult to say. I would think, for the most part, yes. A condition being really a kind of culturally transmitted mindset. Let's put it this way. There's nothing natural about a condition. It's culturally mediated. And in that sense, I would say yes, that even if you don't know what postmodernism is, or you don't know what performatism or metamodernism or one of the other alternatives to postmodernism, you will still basically have assimilated these values that I've been talking about. For example, that belief is important, that agency is important, that being separated from discourse is somehow also important. All these things are basically people, like I said, have assimilated more or less semi-consciously. So in that sense, you could say that we are living in our condition is performatist.
Of course. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Raoul Eshelman, for joining the show.
Well, and thank you, Chung, and it was a pleasure being on your podcast.